In today's world, it seems like your opinion on major topics are made up before you've even had a chance to stop and think. And powerful forces in our media, our social media, and more are shaping the way we understand the world's biggest topics. They're shaping how we understand it, what's left, what's right, and they're all vying for your attention and your perspective to be shaped the way they want it to be. And it's getting increasingly harder to be open minded. And in this video, I'm going to share with you 6 tips on how you can stay open minded in this hyper polarized world that we're living in right now. And if you're new here, my name is Christopher. I host the Open Minds podcast where I talk to people from all walks of life and all backgrounds, people I agree with, people I disagree with, because I truly believe that embracing topics from genuine curiosity will lead us to a better understanding about our own opinions and the pathway forward. This video is about protecting that curiosity, making sure that it's still part of our day to day, because unlike most things, curiosity is actually something that you can keep training and building day by day to make sure that you're staying open minded on these big topics. And that leads me to my first tip. Number 1, train your curiosity like a new neural pathway. Research shows that engaging with new information that challenges your own, challenges the prefrontal cortex of your brain, and regulates your emotional response. And I can tell you this from my own experience. Early on in my career of podcasting, I tackled some of the biggest topics, including abortion. And the more I engaged with both pro-life and pro-choice groups, the more I found that my own opinion was becoming refined, and the way in which I explained these to my friends, family, and coworkers, their opinions were also becoming less emotionally charged. And here's something interesting. We're all sometimes scrolling our phones for that dopamine hit. Did you know that curiosity can also trigger a dopamine response as well? Say you're curious about some of these big topics. It's not necessarily about finding the answer, but research shows that when you actually engage in searching for the answer, your brain's dopamine is kicking in high gear, and you feel more compelled to engage in a respectful dialogue when you're embracing the idea of curiosity above all else. And so, same as we've heard before, the more you hear about the same topics and the same ideas, the more those neural pathways get reinforced. But if you actually train your brain to say, you know what, I don't know what the answer is, and I'm sure there's a compelling reason or rationale on the other side, your brain will naturally not commit to one way of thinking. And so once every so often, once a week, once a month, once every other week, choose to make sure that you're reading or consuming media from someone or something you disagree with. Now, I'm not saying go out and watch inflammatory discussions on YouTube or on social media, but what I am saying is there's academic literature out there that's both conservative and liberal, both socialist and capitalist. There are tons of researchers out there researching different sides of the exact same issue. I'd encourage you to read from different think tanks that are guided by different ethos so that you can at least understand your own perspective that much better. Number 2, and this is really important, it's perhaps more meditative or spiritual, but it's creating that space before you respond. I've learned this just recently talking about immigration here in Canada. It's a hot button topic, especially with the number of temporary foreign workers entering Canada on an annual basis. This has led to a lot of animosity by Canadian citizens and a lot of racism as well in the comment section. Many saying deport them all, send them all back, but really that's a stimulus. It's a knee-jerk reaction to a changing demographic, a changing community, but it's important that we pause for a second and understand at least the government's rationale as well. There are humans at the center of this, people who are coming here without understanding the bigger play that the government's doing, perhaps under false pretenses that they're going to get permanent residency and a pathway to citizenship, not knowing that that may be very unlikely for them and they're only being used for labor. And when I start telling people that, if any of us were in the situations many of these immigrants find themselves in, we'd be on the first flight to Canada as well, doing whatever we could to get away from that scenario. I notice people pause and they suddenly say, you know what? I see that point. It's not them I'm mad at, it's the government. Oops, I don't know what's going on. It's the government. And I think that's the key. Before we respond, we have to pause before. And one thing I found is through dialogue and conversation, when I do pause, I allow myself to have that space so that I can ask a better question. And so, for example, if the initial reaction to immigration is deport them all because our society doesn't need them, quote unquote, if you pause and say to yourself, well, hang on, there's a government policy that is facilitating this. I want to know more about that. And I want to know more about the rationale behind that government policy. Suddenly, you're asking bigger, deeper questions that our mainstream news just isn't covering. And that makes that question that much more important, and it makes it more reflective for governments to act upon. And let me tell you something, governments, media, etc., they absolutely love it when we're not asking thoughtful questions, but instead we're feeling. They love that. It's clicks, it's likes, it's views, it's shares. They would rather us fight and have a knee-jerk reaction than ask the more thoughtful question about what's going on. Number 3, practice cognitive flexibility. I know these are very neural cognitive tips, but I just want to mention I'm a member of the Toronto Public Library, and one thing that I do regularly is I try to read newspapers from around the world. And it's truly interesting when you do that, because what you see in the news and what you hear on TV about some of the countries like China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, when you read their newspapers, and certainly we can argue that it's an extension of government propaganda, et cetera, et cetera. But when you actually read the newspapers and you read some of the stories that are in those newspapers, you get a whole new perception of that country and what's important to them. And by purposely doing this, it actually forces your brain to consistently challenge itself and consider alternate viewpoints. You may not know this, but just doing those simple actions, even if it's once in a blue moon, it actually reshapes how you understand how information is presented to you moving forward. A common trend that I see in mainstream media here in the West is, China is polluting like crazy. It is doing a lot of bad to the environment. And of course, there's no denying that, especially with their population. But one thing I've noticed by consuming Chinese media is the fact that the country is actually investing a lot in solar and wind. And of course, I'm not here to defend nor justify the Chinese Communist Party nor the Chinese government's decisions on many things, but at least it starts rounding out your perspective. The country has invested more in electric vehicles than any other country, perhaps in the entire world. It seems like China's got the whole EV thing figured out. Of course, it benefits that they are not a democratic country. They can make rules quite quickly. But that said, that adds to the complexity when you're having these conversations. And so that's the key. When you start building cognitive flexibility, it allows your brain to hold multiple truths. You're not treating China in this case as a monolithic entity that hates the environment. You're allowing yourself to say, you know what, yes, but also the country is doing X, Y, and Z for the environment. I believe some of the largest solar farms in the world are in India and China. I could be wrong. Someone fact check me on that. But at least it gets your mind out of the idea that these countries just don't care about the environment at all. There is great investments that are being made by many of these countries around the world. It gets me thinking about a really interesting project I worked on in university where the professor said that we had to negotiate a new agreement across 10 different provinces here in Canada, but we had to represent one of the provinces. Not only we had to represent the province, we had to research who was the premier of that province and research their perspective about this specific act. And so coming together as 10 individual groups was really challenging because we had to channel the person that we were supposed to be representing. That was cognitive flexibility. While we might have had our own opinions about something, we had to put those aside and place ourselves in the position of the premier of a specific province whom we disagreed with potentially and argue in favor of that. So cognitive flexibility is very important. Number 4, build a diverse input diet. Pew Research found in 2019, people who only get news from one source have a distorted view of the world. Now, that's not groundbreaking research, but what's interesting is the same research found that those individuals had a distorted perception of the other side. In one of the series that I've done in the past, it was exploring the LGBTQ community. And I can tell you, when I talk to people who are of the trans community, they would tell me all the time that the last thing they want to talk about is their sexual orientation and gender identity. They'd actually be rather treated as normal and not have their sexual orientation and gender identity front and center at every single conversation. And what I picked up from that was, when you look at the LGBTQ community and how it's being uh, communicated through media, it's typically people who are at the extremes, who are fighting for something, that want some type of recognition. We lose perception of there being so many Canadians, Americans who are LGBTQ, who just want to live their lives as normal as possible. And often they're lumped in with some of those on the more extreme ends. And so it got me thinking, like, who speaks for who? If you are trans and you don't agree with, say, a transgender individuals on mainstream media, do they really represent your community and what you want? Definitely not. So having diverse input is so important, because we have this idea sometimes of treating entire groups as monoliths. I mentioned the LGBTQ community. There are indigenous chiefs who want economic development, who want natural gas and oil development in their communities because it means jobs for their communities. And so always challenge yourself when you're confronted with labeling an entire group as holding a specific opinion. You know how many people who are Jewish disagree with the actions of Israel in Gaza right now? We never hear about them, but they do exist. Of course they exist. Where people were we're multidimensional. We have different opinions on most all topics, and it's important that we remind ourselves of this when we're starting to make vast generalizations. And so for me, this means talking to people from different backgrounds, making sure that I'm always engaging with different perspectives as well on a regular basis. And this leads me to tip number 5, which is regulate before you engage. Last year, when I was talking about the LGBTQ in classrooms, I noticed when I talked to parent groups, people were really upset and they were starting to shut down. Many just didn't understand why their children were being forced this ideology in the classroom, and they felt like their voices meant nothing. They were being drowned out by people who were more powerful, who were more organized, who were pushing an agenda, and they felt they had no say. And I just want you to remember, you can't be open-minded if you feel like you're under attack. We've all had those feelings of like our chest tightening, us feeling like we can't speak when people are talking over us. I felt that numerous times, not only in my podcast journey, but also in my personal life. What helps, of course, is regulating yourself, breathing deeper so that you can ask those more thoughtful questions. But also what helps is making sure you understand what the other side is saying more before you respond. So going back to the LGBTQ in classrooms, again, I noticed many parent groups were shutting down because they didn't feel like they were being listened to. To be honest, the better response would be, why should any group talk to my children about something as personal as sexual orientation and gender identity when I, as a parent, need to be having that conversation? The school doesn't take over the place of the parent when it comes to this. So if we do want to engage in LGBTQ in the classrooms, it needs to be a multi-pronged discussion. To be honest, I think the better approach is engaging people we disagree with. Number 6, and this is something I truly live by, I want you all to live in questions. You probably see on my social media, I'm always asking questions that seemingly can't be answered, or my attempt to answer it, but only raising more questions along the way. And that's exactly what I want for all of you. Live in questions. Don't live in answers. Answers, they're not always satisfactory, and they don't always lead to the answer that is best for most people. The better opportunity here is to live in questions. And what I mean by that, I truly do believe civil society, you and me, have so much power in shaping the government that we want in the future if we ask the right questions. If we go along with what the government is saying or not saying, we're leading down a path that can only lead to anxiety, stress, and depression. If you believe literally everything the government says word for word, you're missing out on real, robust thinking, critical thinking of the decisions government's doing. Conversely, if you're only being antagonistic to government, you're missing out on the real challenges governments have in making the decisions that they have to make. So the better option is to live in questions. I don't have the answers. No one I've met has the answers. The prime minister doesn't, the president doesn't, your elected leaders don't. They're all trying to figure out what the best way forward is. And let me tell you something, this hinges on your ability to ask questions. If you're not asking questions, they love it. That means that they can go forward with a policy, a program, spending money, knowing that civil society isn't asking enough questions. I think Donald Trump is experiencing that right now with his base asking questions about Epstein. And that's just one of many topics that can be explored through honest and curious questioning. And I'm not saying ask questions endlessly until you're blue in the face or you make someone else upset, but it's important that you live in those questions because you're not trying to start anything. You're not trying to start a fight or be disrespectful to somebody, but what you're trying to do is poke them further about where their opinions, where the kind of barriers of their opinions are, the boundaries are. And questioning allows that person to say, oh, I didn't think about it from that perspective before. And by asking questions, you're actually deepening your own neural pathways. Remember yourself as a kid, when you're asking your parents, like, why is the sky blue? And why is the highway like this? And da da da. And suddenly, at some point, your parents started explaining things to you. Perhaps they were explaining to you why highways exist and why they go faster, or, what is concrete? Is it asphalt? The simplest questions kids ask, which we all can learn from. There is a moment where the parent actually does answer and the child's brain is flipped and suddenly it all starts making sense to them. That deepens their understanding of their physical world around them. A perfect example is when I was young, I had no idea about fuel and gas and how cars moved forward. And I asked my parents several times, and they were just like dumbfounded. I guess they didn't know. But eventually one day, I think it was my uncle or someone broke down that there's an engine and it, has pistons moving and it translates that to power to the drive shafts, and it needs a fuel injection mix for that to happen. It was a whole thing. But suddenly, I started understanding that the engine is basically like a generator of power and energy that shifts that power to the four wheels. It just blew my mind. It suddenly started making so much sense to me. Up to that point, I had no idea. And to be honest, I kind of still don't. So there you have it, some tips to keep an open mind in a world that basically wants you to stay more closed-minded because they want you fighting with each other on answers that you believe because they've told you those answers. But I argue that no, you have to keep asking questions. Questions is the spice of life. It's how we live. It's how we engage in the world around us. It's by questioning things that we get to better answers and better responses. So leave a like, definitely share, tell all your friends, leave a comment below about something that you have been recently blown away by, that was sparked by you being open-minded. I hope this video helps. I'll definitely catch you in the next one. Thanks so much, everyone. And I hope this helps. I'll definitely catch you in the next one. Please like, share, and subscribe. So there you have it. I hope that helps. I hope that helps. Please like, share, and subscribe. Tell me your stories of how you're staying open-minded. Do this.